Right, so I'm hopeful now. Is my screen coming up?
Yes, it is.
Is it?
You've done it.
Great, okay, thanks very much. So far, technology's working well. Part of the legal update for this month, I thought I would just update briefly on the industry reforms. As you know, I've spoken about these a couple of times throughout the course of the last couple of years, arising from the La Crosse fire and then onwards through some of the various reports. I'll just briefly touch on where we put it in some perspective. So you will recall that back in mid-2017, the Building Ministers Forum commissioned the Shergold-Weir report, which was handed down in February 2018. And that was a report that was a response to some of the incidents that we've seen, in particular the La Crosse fire and then the fire across in the UK, the Grenfell's fire. And the terms of reference of that report were to examine compliance and enforcement problems in relation to or affecting the implementation of the code. And when that report was submitted or handed down, it found that accountability for compliance was unclear and that there were insufficient controls on the accuracy of documentation, and documentation in particular in building processes that lacked the required elements to demonstrate compliance with the code. Now, this report, as you will recall, came up with about 24 recommendations, and a lot of those recommendations were in and around a national approach to registration and training of building practitioners, and a new statutory duty for design practitioners to prepare documentation to ensure that the buildings were compliant with the code. So there was a number, as I say, about 24 recommendations. A lot of them were to do with implementing a registration scheme and also making design practitioners provide compliance certificates that indicated that their design complied with the code. In February 2019, we got the New South Wales Government's response to this report, and they were overwhelmingly in support of the Shergold-Weir report, but indicated that they were going to implement 4 major reforms across the construction industry, and they were the appointment of the building commissioner, and we've seen that. Our good friend down the bottom there, David Chandler, has been appointed. The other one was an overhaul of compliance reporting and registration system. So again, in keeping with the recommendations of the Shergold-Weir report, a registration regime for building practitioners with reporting obligations, and also an industry-wide duty of care to homeowners. So these were the 4 reforms, the major reforms that the New South Wales Government came out with in response to the Shergold-Weir report and indicated that they would be implementing. So what have we seen? Well, we've talked previously about the Design and Practitioners Bill. Well, this bill was passed on the 3rd of June this year. So it's a current act that's now come in, and that bill, it contains reforms, and those reforms are aimed at improving the quality and compliance of design documentation and to strengthen accountability in the design process. I attended a webinar recently where David Chandler was on a panel, and he indicated to the group there that the biggest issue in construction he saw was to restore the trustworthiness of completed buildings. So as a result of, again, not only La Crosse, but moving through to the Opal Tower and the Mascot building, that there's been a deterioration or waning of the trustworthiness of buildings. So he's very much on, and as he says, he sees it as the biggest issue in construction, is re-establishing the trustworthiness of completed buildings. Just for what it's worth, in the press release that came out with this Design and Practitioners Act, Kevin Anderson, the Better Regulation Minister, said that this bill is all about putting consumers first by giving those entering into the property market peace of mind that their homes will be expertly designed and built. So you can see that a lot of this reform is aimed at compliance and accountability and restoring the trustworthiness into the marketplace for these buildings. So what were the key reforms that have come out? Again, as we've recently talked about, one is the registration of building practitioners. Now that's due to commence in July next year, and that's going to ensure that those involved in the process are competent and qualified and have suitable insurance. That's one of the aspects that will be looked at. And their registrations will, like all registrations, be subject to review. And, in the event that they don't stack up or there have been some blemishes, registrations can be cancelled as well. So we suspect at this stage that will be handled by the building commissioner by delegation from the appropriate government authority. The other reform is in the area of compliance declarations. So there are new requirements for compliance declarations of regulated designs. Now, regulated designs, you've got to dive into the Act a little bit to find out what a regulated design is, but that's a design that's prepared for a building element, and there are lists within the Act that set out what a building element are, but there's regulated designs are designs of those building elements, or a design that's prepared for a performance solution for building work. So there's going to be a regime that requires the designer of those to issue a design compliance declaration, basically declaring that their design complies with the code. And the other area of reform is this duty of care, which is going to commence immediately. This is a statutory duty of care, so the builder will owe a duty of care to the owner, and that will run with the property. So it's akin to the statutory warranties that run with the property as it gets on-sold within the relevant period. So we've got this statutory duty of care that will extend to those that the end user of the property, even if that person wasn't the person that entered into the construction contract with the builder. The other reform that's come in, and I must say I wasn't aware of this one till recently, but that it was passed again in the last week or so, is the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act. Now, this is an act that will commence on the 1st of September and applies to Class 2 buildings, or buildings that contain a Class 2 component, so it will cover mixed-use buildings. And it provides for proactive investigation of buildings and rectification of defects by the building commissioner. So it arms the building commissioner with quite a suite of powers to investigate, and gives him a suite of powers to order certain remedies in the event that they do find any defect or non-compliance by the developer. And again, the aim of this act, and again, I say it's just what's on the government website, so it is a little bit their spin, but they say it's to boost the building commissioner's power to stop dodgy builders and developers in their tracks. And I suppose when you look at some of the powers that have been delegated to the secretary, who by delegation will pass those through to the building commissioner, it can in fact stop a developer in their tracks to some extent, because it will allow, the act empowers the secretary, or as I say, the building commissioner by delegation, to issue prohibition orders that will block the issue of an occupation certificate or the registration of a strata plan. So you can see it's very much in keeping with this idea of stopping them in their tracks. They can issue stop work orders, and they can also issue building work rectification orders. And I'll speak a little bit more about those in a minute when I set out a bit more detail. But so you can see that there's quite a range of far-reaching powers that this Act provides to the Secretary, or as I say, by delegation through to the Building Commissioner. So the Act gives the authorised officers a right of broad investigative powers. It also requires developers to provide advanced notice of expected completion dates. So no less than 6 and no more than 12 months before a developer anticipates that he'll be making an application for an occupation certificate, they have to provide advanced notice to the building commissioner that that's where they're up to. So it's to be seen, but will that flag a flurry of investigations or inspections by the Commissioner at that point in time, given that they do have the power under this Act to prohibit or hold up the issuing of an occupation certificate? That's to be seen. There also creates some offences for non-compliance with orders that are issued under this Act, and also there is some potential exposure for personal liability for developers that contravene this Act. But I think that probably the most serious or the greatest one, if it's used correctly and is in fact enforced, is this ability of the building commissioner, where there's a serious defect found, to issue a building work rectification order. Now, time will tell how that actually plays out in real life, but it certainly affords the building commissioner with significant powers to go in there, and in the event that they do find or reasonably believe that there is a serious defect, then they can issue a rectification order. So what is a serious defect? A serious defect refers to a non-compliant building element, so non-compliant with compliance with the BCA. So again, you've seen throughout this whole discussion about industry reform, it's about ensuring ensuring compliance with the code, and that sort of I think flows through to this concept of trying to put the element of trustworthiness back into the buildings. So if the commissioner finds that there is a serious defect, in other words, non-compliance with the code, or defective design or faulty workmanship, or non-conforming building products, so where there's been the use of a building product that has been a banned product under the Building Safety Act, and as you know, again from my previous presentations, the only one on that list at the moment is the combustible cladding with 30% polyethylene core. Then the Commissioner has powers under this new Act to issue a building rectification order. So you can see, again, just those are a couple of acts that have been passed through in the last month that will start progressively over the coming months and beyond. As we've discussed before, the Design and Practitioners Act is going to require registration and compliance and the lodging of declarations that buildings and designs comply with the code, and will also extend this statutory warranty out for the owner's benefit. And then this second act, this Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act, you'll see provides a suite of powers that can be quite far-reaching, that are aimed at getting the Commissioner involved and allowing the Commissioner to basically pull a developer up and, as they say in their press release, stop them in their tracks through, prohibiting the issuing of occupation certificates, or stop work, or requiring, or the issuing of rectification orders where they find a serious defect, as that term is defined in the Act. So they're just a couple of recent bills that are passed through and are now become law, that are all, as I say, in keeping with the various reports and the intentions that have been stated in the government in respect of driving reform in the industry. And so time will tell how successful those are. But that's where we're at. That's where we're at recently in the reform game, or the reform area. That's all I had.
Thanks, Mark. Could you stop sharing your screen? And there's a couple of chat questions for you.
Right. So
you'll be able to see those on the chat in the bottom.
Stop share. Okay, so if I stop sharing, yep.
Can you see the chat questions?
I can. I'm just going back up to the top.
Yep.
Will the registration of builders extend to the commercial sector? That's a good question. It's a little bit unclear at this stage. There was certainly in the bill, there was intentions, or there were suggestions that the registrations may extend into the commercial sector, but it doesn't appear that it necessarily has as yet. But the regulations haven't been issued. But there's certainly, because that's one of the criticisms, or one of the findings of the various reports, is that you've got registration in the residential field, but no registration required in the commercial area. So at this stage, it's to be just watch this space. I suspect that that's probably where it's going to head, but at this stage, it hasn't gone that far.
Would that extend to licensing in the commercial space, do you think, Mark?
I think licensing has to be incorporated into it. As I say, at this stage, this is all around registration and design.
Yeah.
And as I say, it hasn't extended into the commercial sector that I'm aware of as yet. But I think, yeah, personal view, I think it has to, you know, as a matter of time, it really has to extend there.
Yep.
Louis asks, does the Residential Act give a clear... No, the structural defect definition is found in the Residential and Apartment Buildings Act. So there are, regrettably, we've now got a structural defect and a major defect. And I'll be honest, I haven't actually put them side by side, but they do refer to, in fact, I can tell you the structural defects refer to defects of building elements, and that picks up waterproofing. I'm just going to dive in here. Building elements are defined as, so this is a serious defect to a building element as a fire safety system within a building, for a building within the meaning of the building code, waterproofing, internal or external load-bearing components of a building that is essential to the stability, a component of a building that is part of the building enclosure, and those aspects of the mechanical, plumbing and electrical services for a building that are required to achieve compliance with the code, and then other things that are prescribed by the regulation. So there may yet be a little bit more in the regulations.
Mark, I'd suggest that that definition of serious defect, where the definition of defective building element or building product is pretty similar to the definition of a major defect in the Home Building Act.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'd be surprised if there was a significant. I just haven't lined them up one against the other and had a close look at them. Yeah. Yeah. What type of insurance do you think a builder will be required to carry? I think that where they're involved in design, then obviously I think this is going to go down the professional indemnity path. It's yet to be seen, as I say, exactly whether they specify the insurances, but I think as part of any registration process, I think that I suspect that when you reapply or do your annual memberships, you will be required to provide evidence of the insurances that are in place. So I think that the part of that registration process will not only ensure that building practitioners carry out or undertake a number of CPD points, as many of us have to do now already, but also as part of the registration process. I suspect that where that's going is to provide evidence that the insurance is in fact in place. And I don't think that it's a reference to the home warranty insurance. I think that will stand, that's on a project by project basis, and that will remain as is. Graham, thank you for your comment, Graham. Appreciate that. Michael, can you expand on the relationship between these powers and the Home Building Act? Well, I think that they will. I think that they were, whilst they're designed to work with each other, there's no, as I've been able to see as yet, no direct interrelation between the two. The Home Building Act will still obviously be there in its existing form. There will be owners will still be able to rely on the statutory warranties that are contained in the Home Building Act. What the Design and Practitioners Act does is it extends one of the builder's obligations in that it provides this statutory duty of care, which is not picked up for in the Home Building Act. So as well as breaches of the statutory warranties in the Home Building Act, an aggrieved owner may also find that they have the benefit of a statutory warranty that they can pursue under this Design and Practitioners Act. So I think that they will work together, but as I say, the Design and Practitioners Act is all about registration and having compliance certificates, for all the various designs. If there's a variation to a design, then a further compliance certificate has to be issued. These compliance certificates or compliance declarations are to be issued by registered practitioners, and therefore the registered practitioners will be, as I say, subject to all the various registration requirements and requirements to hold relevant insurances.
Mark, I think what one of the things that this new act does, it expands the remedies that arise under the Home Building Act insofar as it expands the range of possible defendants. So under the Home Building Act, your defendants are, in relation to the statutory warranties, the builder and the developer. This extends to engineers, architects, and anyone who is a registered practitioner who's had something to do with the design or construction of the particular building. So it expands the range of possible defendants in that way.
No, that's absolutely right, and that's probably put a lot more clearer than I was putting it. Yes, so if you've got a registered design practitioner who's been involved in the design of the building, then there's a statutory duty that's created between that designer and the homeowner that will run with the property. So you're right, it'll allow the owner to get access in the event of a claim to those design practitioners involved in the process as well. Yes. Christopher, is it the body corporate who makes the complaint to the commissioner? I would suspect and suggest yes, that it would be the body corporate in the high rise would make, because at the end of the day, it's the body corporate that owns the structures. The structure, the owners only own the airspace in between the walls. So I think it would be a body corporate who would make that complaint to the commissioner. Yep.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Mark.
Yeah.
You're more than welcome, as always.
You're going to do part two, David?
Yeah.
Part two of the presentation?
Well, part two, yeah. Mark, when we were discussing today's presentation, he said, look, I'm happy to put my hand up for the technical part, but the jokes are all yours.
I'm far too young for those jokes, David.
So I thought I'd actually just finish off as we usually do on a slightly lighter note, just to remind everybody that lawyers are actually people, and they suffer from the same fallibilities of everybody else, and particularly in this coronavirus environment. I came across a little piece about one of the Magic Circle law firms in the UK. The Magic Circle law firms are the big firms in the city in London, and this firm had to issue an edict to its staff not to steal toilet rolls and hand sanitizer from the office in response to the coronavirus outbreak. The managing partner apparently had to write to staff warning them not to take a 5-finger discount to toilet rolls supplied at the office. He said, I understand from the Walbrook management team that there's been a spate of thefts from the lavatories throughout the building of sanitizer dispenser and lavatory paper, calculating that some 120 rolls had gone missing that week alone. A spokeswoman indeed for the firm, who it suggested might have been on some kind of a bonus per pun, issued a statement saying it's mind-boggling that toilet paper roll has been disappearing. We understand that the Walbrook Buildings management team is taking a paper-thin view of the matter. As good tenants, we notified our colleagues and asked them to keep a Luke out. So as I say, lawyers are actually people, and some would say they need more toilet roll than the rest of the community. Thanks, gentlemen.
Yeah, good one. Thanks, guys. Great update. Yeah, and so we've got some moving pieces happening in that part of the construction industry at the moment that are going to make it interesting for us. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is Louis Stanton today. He's been a member of the ASBC since 2013 and comes with great experience in the industry in report writing and inspecting across a wide range of topics and subjects. So Leo is going to talk to us today about the pre-purchase inspection reports and the requirements under the Australian standard. I'll hand over to you, Leo.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all. Can everyone hear me loud and clear?
Yep.
Yep.
Excellent. Firstly, I do apologise that I am going to concentrate on the Australian standard 4349.1. I know that some of you are not really in that side of the business, in that side of the industry. However, it's important to have a look at what we're doing in relation to the Australian standard, because that can be applied to any report that you do, whether it be a pre-purchase or defects report or an expert witness report. So either, you know, you can apply the same principles. So I'm just sharing the screen. So if you just bear with me, I'll bring up the slideshow. Okay, what do you see on the screen, Joe? If you can just give me some guidance.
Okay. Still, it's ready to give a slideshow.
Bear with me one moment.
You had to.
Sorry, technology's not my best either, but just bear with me. I'll just do
It seems that you're before the
Mark?
Control F7, Leo.
Control.
Now you can convert from the PowerPoint presentation onto the big screen.
Yeah.
Control F7.
Is it Control F7 or Control F5?
Oh, no, try both. What's the worst that can happen?
Well, there we go. I'll just come back out of there again and I'll just go back into it again. Just bear with me one moment. I think what the problem is that I've got the presentation sitting at the back. I just go back into, sorry about this. I'll share the screen again.
Oh, fine.
Okay, there you are. Share screen. Okay, so are you seeing in front of you? The actual slideshow? There we go. Now we're in business.
Nah, one of mine.
Okay, how are we now?
That's it. Well done.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. So today's presentation, I'm going to be talking to you today in regards to same, but different. What do we mean by same, but different? What does that mean to us? And you've heard the saying before. So what I did, I Googled it this morning. I thought I'd like to know what Google says about it. And same, but different comes up normally means something is functionally or substantially the same as something else, but differ in methods of implementation or in minor details. And that's very true when you have a look at sample reports of different type of reports that you can get in a pre-purchase. You know, I did that exercise just recently and found that I looked at 5 different samples and saw they were very, very different to each other, but they still had the same common thread. And as the Irish say, that everyone is the same, only different. This difference is due mainly to the fact that every individual has a different temperament. So if you have a look at a report, it's the same, but different. Let's go into that and see what we're talking about here. So firstly, I just I'm just going to experiment with something. I hope this will come through. I'm going to play a tune for you, and if you can give me a thumbs up, which is on the bottom of your screen. If you go down towards the bottom, you can see reaction. You can do a thumbs up. Can anyone, or does anyone recognise this tune? So as you know, that tune is, I'll just bring that up again. Sorry, that tune is Mrs. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel. Pretty well known song back in the, I think that was actually written in the 50s, I think, or the 60s, sorry. So very well known by the artist. Does anyone recognise this tune? So that song, for those who don't know who that is, that's Mrs. Robinson by the Lemonheads. So another version of that, of Mrs. Robinson. I'd like to play one more version. Tell me if you recognise this particular version. For those who are not sure what version that is, that's actually Mrs. Robinson by the Beatles. So the Beatles also came up with a version of Mrs. Robinson. But I think the point that I'm trying to make all through this is what's so significant about those two, those three particular versions. You notice they're the same lyrics. And that was the point I was trying to make by that you can still have the same lyrics, but it is presented very differently. And so the whole purpose of following a standard is that we all write our reports to have the same ingredients, to have the same information. And it could be same, but very different in its presentation. But most importantly, that we follow the guidelines. So when we're writing a report, we obviously follow a standard. And in this case, if you're doing general inspections, whether it be defects or expert witness reporting or dilapidation reports of the like, we follow AS 4349.0, which is the inspection of buildings for general requirements. AS 4349.1, inspection for buildings, is obviously for the pre-purchase inspection for residential cottage work. AS 4349.2 is common area of group titled properties. That's strata and company titles, of course. And AS 4349.3 is for the timber pest inspection. So what is the standard? What do we mean by a standard? The best way to describe it is standards are published documents setting out specifications and procedures designed to ensure products, services and systems are safe, reliable and consistently performing to the way that they're intended to. That's very important to understand, consistently performing to the way that they're intended to. They establish a common language which defines quality and safety criteria. So if you're going to apply the standard, you need to have ingredients in your type of report that make sense. So if, for argument's sake, I said to you, let's bake a cake. Say, if I said to you 5 ingredients that will make up a cake, most of you would probably say you need flour, you'll need water, You might need sugar. You might put salt, depending on what you're doing, what type of cake that you're doing, and you may use ingredients like butter and other things to make it all gel. Well, when you're applying Australian Standard 4349.1, there are 5 main ingredients that you also need to make it all gel. Firstly, you need a scope and you need a general criteria of where and what areas you are to do in this particular report. What areas are defining your scope? What is your purpose? And what areas you're going to look into and what areas that you're not going to look into. Secondly, you must have an inspection agreement. You can't possibly do an inspection of any type, whether it be a pre-purchase, a defects report, an expert witness report, or anything of the kind. You need a inspection agreement before you can undertake any inspection. Further to that, the inspection itself, you need to know what are you looking at? What have you been sent out to do? And who sent you out? Who has commissioned you to go out and do this report? And what are those things that you're going to look for? Are you going to look internally, externally? Does it include the subfloor? Or is it something specific? You may be asked to go out and do an inspection on 3 defects only, and you are to report just on those 3 defects. You need to understand the report and what the requirements are under the Australian Standard 4349.1 and what the requirements are when you are reporting. So the report writing aspect of your investigation is very, very important and vital in the 5 ingredients. And obviously any supporting evidence that you can use that may bolster your information and the evidence that you have found. And it could very well be an outside source. It could very well be an article in a local paper talking about the effects of pooling of water and ponding of water and why that is an issue. So you can draw information and evidence and bring it into your report, especially if you're doing defect reporting, because that is more specific in what we're doing here. Today I'm just going to concentrate on the inspection, the 3rd aspect of the 5 ingredients. So one of the things that you need to define is the following areas shall be inspected where applicable. So you are to look at, in a pre-purchase, you need to look at all the elements. So it's really important that when you're doing a pre-purchase, that you actually stipulate what areas you went into and what areas that you haven't. The code clearly states that you must look at the interior of the building, the roof space, the exterior of the building, the subfloor, the roof exterior, and the property within 30 metres of the building. It's really important that you define 30 metres of a building, especially if you're doing inspections on acreage, because if it's not stipulated that you're doing the property within 30 metres of the building, then the expectation is that when you're going out to do the inspection that you look at the whole site. And so 5 acres is a large parcel to cover. And is it necessary to cover the 5 acres? So it's very important that you have a look at the purpose of the report and what the instructions were to ask you to define your report. As Glenn mentioned, you have our duties as a professional. Well, you need to follow your duties as a building consultant when doing a pre-purchase, and that is your duty of care and obviously your duty to warn. Those two go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Duty of care works in finding those defects and also performing an inspection to find those defects. But it's very important that we bring it home and inform our client of the possible consequences of your findings during the report. Those two are very important, especially in, to reduce the chance of litigation against you. I'll just read, there's an abstract on part 3.2.2 on page 12 of the code where it talks about the inspection shall include all accessible areas and areas that are within the inspector's line of sight and close enough to enable reasonable appraisal. Reasonable access shall be determined in accordance with the provisions of Table 3.2. And Table 3.2 goes on by talking about the access into a roof space or access from the roof exterior, where we talk about the accessibility from a 3.6 metre ladder placed on the ground, not onto paint tins or something or on bricks. It is on natural ground. So it's really important that the inspector does actually adhere to that. So when we talk about defects, obviously one of the purposes of why we are doing a pre-purchase is not only just talking about the condition of the building or even the safety issues, which are very important, but we should also do an appraisal for defects. We are searching for any defects that may be apparent. And the inspector shall appraise all the building elements, including structural elements for the presence of defects, as specified in Table 3.3. Again, I'll take an abstract from there saying that defects not fall neatly into one of the categories of defects described in 3.3. So what I've just taken that little line out of there to say that when you're doing a defects report or even a pre-purchase, we have to categorise what those defects are. And those defects range from the categories, and I'll bring up the next screen. I beg your pardon, I haven't put that in there, but the categories from A to F, talking about water damage, is it structural damage, has it been affected by installation of the product, is it working to its capacity? So there's a whole variety of categories, and you don't necessarily box them into one category. Something that is a major defect could possibly fall into 5, possibly 6 of those categories when you're doing this type of inspection. So how do we inform the client? How do we capture the duty of care and the duty to warn when we're doing the inspection? We have to be very careful with our description, because our description can shape and possibly give our reader, we must give them a firm understanding of what we're trying to say. So I guess that the best way to do to utilise that is to use what I call the 4 Ws and cover the things such as what is it, where is it in the building that is. So you have to define which room you're in. Are you internally, externally? And what are you looking at? What are the problems associated with what you're looking at? How is this going to impact on the building? And what are those defects? Do you see those defects as being possibly an ongoing defect? Is it major? Is it minor? And to what degree does it affect the building? And what does the purchaser need to do about finding, once they have that defect, once it's been defined, what is their obligation as the purchaser? What do they need to do? And it's important that we cover the 4 Ws, so we are covering our duties, our duty to care and our duty to warn. So the inspector shall record the following information. So it's important that the inspector covers the undertaking of the inspection. What was he required to do? Identify those areas. Also, identify the client. Who is the client? And their details, and what details we can provide for our reader. Do we need to know who the builder was? If they're going to acquire a property, they must need to know who the builder was, and possibly, and very importantly, how old is that building? What is the age of that building? We must give clear and concise address of the property inspector, which is pretty obvious, the date of the inspection and time, weather conditions at the time of the inspection, which is very important because weather conditions can affect the course of what defects we're looking at, especially if water is involved, the limitations of the inspection with respect to accessible areas, what areas we went into and what areas we didn't, and obviously and foremostly, I think, is the observation of defects. But it doesn't just stop there, it's also the observation of also safety items. Safety items are just as important as the defects on a particular building. So it's important that the purchaser or the potential purchaser is aware of what lies ahead in regards to this building before they acquire the property. You could use check sheets. I mean, certainly I use this particular check sheet. This is a very old check sheet, but you know, when I first started doing this, I started applying these this particular check sheet to make sure that I didn't miss anything and that I covered all the items. And as you can see from this particular slide, that 1.1 talks about the weather, 1.2 the if the building's occupied, and so on. But more importantly, if you look down on 1.5, 1.6 and 1.7, it is important that we also talk about the frequency of the minor and major defects due to the age of the building to give our reader an idea, a snapshot of this particular building and its wear and tear over the time. And obviously the age, that also is comparison to the age. When we also talk about the building is considered, that's obviously the overall condition. It's only a summary. You don't go into depth in this particular section when you're talking about the summary, because in your report you should be defining more information for them to read on. What is a major defect? What was a minor defect? And the condition, obviously, of the building. Further to that, the consultant has the ability to follow the code and gives us an area of what items we need to report on. For argument's sake, what you see in front of you is the interior of the building. You know, we need to establish these finer points for our readers so they know what the condition of the building is. There's no need to talk about, you know, what type of furniture is in the place and what type of fittings are in it, unless the fittings are defective on what you see. But these are the items that we need to concentrate on when we're doing a pre-purchase. And so the code clearly states what aspects we need to look at every element. So the exterior, the roof exterior, the roof space and the subfloor and so on. And there's the site, of course. What items we need to look at while we're looking at the site. Very important. The last point is surface water. I think drainage effectiveness is very, very important and can be overlooked when you're doing a visual inspection on a pre-purchase. So it's really important that you look at the surface water, because that plays a big part on when you're doing an inspection for a pre-purchase and can be easily overlooked. Other templates that you could use is another checklist. I use this checklist when I'm doing quality assurance, just a checklist to say, yep, I've checked that. Yes, the quality of that's fine. Yes, that's fine, and so on. Or if I have to report back on something for action to be taken. So templates are very important when we're doing pre-purchase inspections. So just to wrap it up, in summary, if you follow the requirements of Australian Standard 4349.1, you will get the same. If you follow the tables, check sheets, templates, you will get the same. But how we are different is the information that you provide. Follow a strategy on site, yet present the information in your own way, in your own format, and then you will always achieve different. Same, but different. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Leo. Fantastic. I think we have one question there.
Just open that up.
For the lawyers, about the legal requirements.
Oh, yes. Is it a legal requirement to write a report to the Australian standards? Well, thank you for that, Eamon. I've been trying to actually call you in regards to some of the questions, other questions that you did have, so I can talk to you privately on that. But just to answer your question, the Australian Standard 4349.1 is a requirement for pre-purchase, and we need to follow that when we're doing our report writing. So on a legal side of things, the Australian Standard was created to write specifically this type of report. So hopefully I've answered that question for you. But please give me a call if you require further information.
David or Mark, have any viewpoint on that?
Yeah, look, the Australian Standard is exactly that. It's a standard. If you write a report and you expressly say that this report is written in accordance with the Australian Standard, then you're adopting it and you're required to comply with it. And if you don't comply with it, then you'll be in breach of your contract with your client. However, you can exclude the standard. You can say that these are the conditions on which this report is made. So Leo mentioned one of the things that you need to deal with in your report is the scope of the report. So you could limit the scope of your report to something less than the Australian Standard, and as long as you can show that your client read and understood that, then that's fine too. If you don't mention the standard, then it could be that a client will say, well, your report was negligent, or it wasn't done with due care and skill, and my evidence of that is that it doesn't comply with the standard. In other words, using the standard as a benchmark, it won't necessarily be accepted as the benchmark to which the report was required to reach, but it is a very persuasive guide. So in a nutshell, if you say you're doing it in accordance with the standard, then you must do it in accordance with the standard. If you're not going to do it in accordance with the standard, then you would need to say that expressly in your when you're setting out the scope and the limits of your report.
I think it's important that when you, just going on that, David, that in particular, when you're writing the report, as I said, you need to stipulate what areas you went into and what areas you didn't. And that should also be tied in when you do your agreement, because your agreement should also let the potential purchaser know what areas you're going to look at and what areas that you can't look at. So it's very important that that's very clear and concise, so your reader can make that decision. Is this the property that they want to purchase?
Yep. All right. Any more questions?
I had a question, if that's okay, Mark.
You got a question? Shoot, Dale.
Leo, how do you feel about inspectors that only adopt the requirement to have a structural only inspection as per that standard?
When we start talking about structural, we've got to be very careful that we stay within our area of expertise. To do a structural report as a building consultant, if you don't have that engineering background to talk about the structure and its properties and its behaviour, and it's outside your area of expertise, you're actually breaching the Australian Standard 4349.1, because it clearly states that only comment on areas of your area of expertise, and those areas that you're not an expert in should be referred to a professional who can comment on that, who is qualified to do that, who's licensed and qualified to do that. Also, it's also one of the requirements of the 4 Ws. You know, the last item I said is, what does the purchaser need to do about this? Well, the code clearly talks about clear and concise recommendations, obviously using photographic evidence, but also referring to somebody who has that qualification. So those who do structural reports have to be very careful that it is within their area of expertise.
So, Leo, Appendix A refers to pre-purchase structural inspections. There's a lot of inspectors out there that rely on Appendix A only to do their pre-purchase inspection, and they specifically only operate in that environment of Appendix A.
So we are all from a building background. We are licensed builders previously, and most of us are still licensed builders. So we have the expertise to comment on structure, but we have to be very mindful that when we're talking about structural defects, that unless we have that qualification and that understanding, and not necessarily just from an engineering background, it could be from a waterproofing aspect. You could be talking about a structural defect that is a waterproofing membrane situation. Unless you have that qualification, you have that experience and background, really you should be referring it to the expert beyond your expertise. So it is a very grey area. You have to be very careful what you report on, and certainly if you find yourself in the courts for a comment that you may have made in a pre-purchase, the member will certainly look at your qualifications and say, are you certainly qualified to make a judgment on this? Why didn't you refer it to an expert?
Thanks, Leo.
Thanks, Dale.
Thanks. Eamon had another question there about mainly about vendor reports, I'm taking it, and who is the client in your agreement if you're doing vendor reports or reports are getting on-sold?
Yeah.
As well.
Again, there is the question of who has sent you and what they have sent you for. If you're doing a pre-sale, for argument's sake, a pre-sale report for a vendor before they list it for sale, certainly that type of report would be only just for that reader and that reader only. And that particular reader must follow your guidelines, and it's up to them if they make those changes before they put it on for sale. So you've got to know who your client is. Is it a vendor, or is it somebody like a potential purchaser who's looking at acquiring this particular property? So again, once you know what your purpose is, what your scope is, and what they've asked you to do, your report could look very different. A vendor's report could look very different to a purchaser's report, but you must make it very clear that the report is strictly for that purpose only. It's very important that that's very clearly stated in the purpose of the report. There was a question by John, I think it said may not be covered for insurance purposes. John, are you referring that the professional indemnity insurance, is that the line that you're looking at? Thanks for that, John. Look, to enable you to do a pre-purchase inspection, and certainly if you are accredited with let's say the Master Builders Association, for argument's sake, one of the requirements is that you need to have professional indemnity insurance. And I think that, and David and Glenn can jump in on this and say that you are taking a major, major risk if you don't have your professional indemnity insurance, and also a component of public liability as well in that same policy. But you are opening yourself to litigation because you are not having the insurance that covers you should you miss something. It's very important that and whether you're doing pre-purchase or defect reports or any other reporting, that you need to have the professional indemnity insurance as something to fall back on in this situation, especially in a pre-purchase where the risk is quite major.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not sure how everyone's finding the professional indemnity insurance at the moment. The market is hardening up and tightening in Australia with the risks. Yeah, especially tied into Mark's presentation earlier with the professionals bill that's coming out. Yeah, so professional indemnity insurance is going through the roof price-wise and becoming more and more difficult to obtain, I think. Well,
like it's probably no wonder given all the idiots that's doing it.
Yeah.
Like it's their own fault.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Leo.
Thank you, gentlemen.